Welcome back to Running Out of Time, our Heart Health Month series on KMOB 1003 radio. Week 1 was the reality. Black hearts are failing sooner because intervention is coming later. Week 2 was the warning. Symptoms aren't subtle, they're ignored. And today, in Week 3, we focus on what too many people still treat like a lifestyle issue instead of a medical risk: stress. Chronic stress is not abstract. It leaves biological evidence. It raises blood pressure, disrupts sleep, increases inflammation, and silently reshapes the body over time. This is not about weakness. This is about survival inside systems that keep demanding more. Welcome to Week 3, Stress and Symptoms.
You know, one of the things that I want to talk about, we talked about personal responsibility, but how do we separate personal responsibility from systemic reality? Because it's a big difference. I mean, I can do all that I'm supposed to do, but it's a systemic reality out there.
Well, the systemic reality is what we've talked about before when we talk about bias and we talk about social determinants of health. But again, the first part of this for me is that we have to advocate for ourselves. I mean, that's just the first step. You have to realize that there are health issues that we should know about, health issues that we should look into. Simple things like, again, checking our blood pressures at home, making sure that we know the family history, that we know there's a tendency for people to have heart failure and strokes, and that we present as an informed consumer. And when you walk into that provider's office, you say, my mother's had heart failure, my father's had a stroke. I want to be evaluated to see kind of where I am. What are my risks? I think I'm healthy now. Let's check some general things, blood pressure, weight, et cetera, get some basic blood work, when we can do that. And then we start from there. We have that conversation. There are certain things that can be done to assess risk levels for different cardiovascular illnesses. Some of those involve, more resources. Some of those don't. But I think we have to at least present, to our providers. One of the things that I find interesting, and I like when celebrities and famous people have illnesses or conditions because it gets publicized.
Yeah.
And everybody, kind of wants to know about what's my chance for having this. A good example that I can use, common knowledge, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar had a condition called atrial fibrillation, and he was doing a promotion for a drug company that takes care of that particular illness. And so people would come in and say, hey, can you check me to see if I have that atrial fibrillation? Do I need to be on that medication? And they didn't. But again, he educated them. And because he was who he is, the influencer that he is, people paid attention when that ad came on. And so I think we need to do more of that with our communities. Another initiative that I'll share with you is what we call Champions of Change, where we are actively embracing athletes and famous individuals to help us educate our public, to help us be influential, and that when they come on TV, hey, this is so-and-so, he's a world-class famous athlete. What's he got to say? And when they talk about an illness, it may not be that they're personally involved with that illness, but at least they're talking about it. It generates attention. It generates people coming in asking questions. And so I think that's just another way we have to figure out how to appeal to individuals to even listen to the message, and to become educated about the potential that these are things that affect us, and especially our athletes. Hey, this guy is all world, all class. He could probably live and run forever. But when we find out that, hey, there is that fragility of health, then that makes people more likely to say, hey, maybe I should get checked. This individual I thought would live forever, but they have, atrial fibrillation, or they've had a heart attack. And so I think that's important that we embrace our celebrities and famous people to help us with the messages that will open doors that perhaps Dr. Nichols or myself, we can't open. They turn on the TV and see us, they go to, ESPN. Okay. So I think it's important that we embrace those individuals, and that's our Champions of Change.
Dr. Fletcher mentioned several exceptional areas of looking at this. One thing we have not had any conversations about around the miswarning is what's the political side of that, and that impact of this based on the systematic approach. The systems are not in place to just say, I'm not going to see patients. The systems are in place based on some of the political policies that exist today. And it's so key to begin to look at what those policies look like, whether the impact of those policy on a hospital or a physician's office or providing the services in a community where there may not be transportation, there may not be ambulance. I'll never forget a 3-year-old child died when I was a child, which led to me telling my father I wanted to be a doctor. He was hit by a Mack truck, and it's just so happened in the east end of Little Rock, Arkansas, Dr. Fletcher, where all three of us have some associations. And what was so challenging to me and so painful was that I had to watch that child lay there for a long period of time because an ambulance could not get across the tracks in time to save his life. And so when you begin to look at from a policy perspective, what are the policies in place? How do we talk with those in office about what policies should be in place in the state and at the federal level in order to make sure there are rules and regulations to where things can occur within a timely fashion to help with the systemic challenges that we see? How do you advocate for healthcare within not only the system, but within the communities to have places where right now the public health rules are that a doctor or a hospital has to be within 30 miles as a part of a managed care system, and how they put together their overall applications or the information around how close a patient has to be to a doctor or a hospital. But that 30 miles can be a challenge. And so the policies, the political arena, the education, the knowing what the warning signs are, not missing those, and being able to work early with your family and with your friends to understand what are needed. CPR, we've mentioned so many things today that I think are important that will help with the missed warning signs. That challenge does exist systemically, but I think we too need to focus on how we can make an impact on the systemic approach to heart disease and healthcare in our communities.
Wonderful. Thank you. A lot of knowledge there. I mean, coming from a cardiologist and also coming from Dr. Nichols with lived experience. And she mentioned before that she actually died. And was that when you're there? I mean, you died once? Did you die twice? You mentioned that, I mean, in your book. So tell me, I mean.
So Pam, it depends on how you define that. I would say I obviously died the original time and was taken to the local hospital after an extensive resuscitation effort in which I fell on my curling iron. And in addition to having the massive heart attack, I also had a 6-inch burn that went all the way to the bone. And when I got to the definitive hospital that could do something, and eventually gave me a heart transplant, they had to decide if they were going to put me in CCU, CVICU, or in the burn unit, and they were able to pull that together. I state in my book and in public setting, I died 3 times. That first death was at home with my daughter doing CPR and arriving to the local hospital. The second death was when they took out my dead heart and put in the heart of a 22-year-old, which has just been amazing to me. So thankful to the family. Another area we need to someone talk about: donations, heart transplant, kidney donation in our community, and how do we give to other people. I am a donor and have been organ donor most of my life. And then the third one was post. I went back in for what is a biopsy, and they discovered that I had what's called cardiac tamponade. Cardiac tamponade is where there was an incident that led to somewhat of a hold in my heart proper, in the muscle of my heart, which was leaking blood. We believe it was because one of the stitches came loose and blood was seeking into the sac around my heart. And they only had minutes to get me in to correct that problem in order that I would not die. So technically 3 deaths. And I always talk about it in the 3 deaths because without the first one, the second or third would not occur. And I think it'll be great to have Dr. Fletcher talk a little bit about that cardiac tamponade and some of the things that you see from the cardiologist's perspective when they're on their end dealing with the patient. And I'm trying to stay in my patient role, everyone.
That could be challenging since you are a physician. But, before we talk about tamponade, cardiac arrests are more common in the African American community. than the non-African American community. Perhaps also the survival from cardiac arrest is less likely to occur just because of the location and the lack of access to aggressive medical care. Cardiac tamponade is not an unusual phenomenon. It can happen for many, many reasons. It can happen related to trauma. It can happen as a result of malignancies. It can happen as a result of an infectious process. It can happen as a result of even perhaps some medical procedures that we do that aren't necessarily negligence, but because of the potential complication. If you're biopsying something, or if you're doing a procedure to do an ablation or something, that is just one of the mentioned potential complications that can occur. And as Dr. Nichols so appropriately discussed, it is the accumulation of a large quantity of blood in the sac around the heart. And the heart is sort of wrapped, if I may, sort of like a cellophane or saran wrap like material. There are two layers of that. One is around the actual muscle of the heart itself, and the other sort of lines the cavity that the heart sits in. And routinely, there's a small amount of fluid in that sac that acts as a cushion. So that's why when we jump and do things, the heart, is protected to some degree. And it's also a protective issue from infections and things of that variety. If something happens for some reason and that fluid increases, if it increases suddenly, like with trauma, then a smaller quantity of blood very quickly accumulating could cause the heart to sort of be strangled, so to speak. The heart is not able to expand and contract appropriately because of the pressure from this fluid. Over long periods of time, if it's a slow accumulation, like with a tumor or some other viral illness, then, or even from some medication, sometimes you can have larger quantities of fluid accumulate before you get the restriction of the heart. When you get tamponade, that is an emergency. And so that can be relieved either with the insertion of a needle and drawing out some of that fluid under good close fluoroscopic or CAT scan or ultrasound guidance, or surgically. They can actually go in and make a little window and drain that fluid. So tamponade is something that can occur, and certainly something that can be addressed appropriately when caught early enough with the right approach and technique. So that's sort of the nature of tamponade. But again, not something that commonly everybody has, walking around the street. It's usually going to be related to the things that I mentioned, and then we'll kind of see that occur.
Thank you.
Dr. Fletcher, because I just had my heart transplant, they were able to just reopen my chest a second time and do the actual work they needed to do for the car.
And last questions, I'm going to go. It's going to be someone listening in on this, and they're going to think, none of that applies to me. What would you tell them? What do you want them to hear?
When you say none of that applies to me, obviously, I'm assuming we're not talking about tamponade. But when we talk about, hypertension and diabetes and obesity and hardening of the arteries, high cholesterol, potential congestive heart failure, stroke, heart attacks, all of those things potentially can apply to all of us in this country. Again, that is the number one reason that Americans die in this country, regardless of race, sex, religion, etc. And as an African American, again, that is the number one reason that we die in this country, regardless as to male or female. And so the fact that you can say it doesn't apply to me might be that at this point you are healthy, or at this point you are asymptomatic. Unfortunately, when our young people are involved in trauma, or they were in war and they were unfortunately a casualty of war, and we've done autopsies, young people in their late teens, early 20s, many of those have early streaks of cholesterol buildup in their arteries, meaning that the process of arteriosclerotic vessel disease, i.e. layman's called hardening of the arteries, has started. And so even in your late teens, early 20s, this process has started, going back to what we talked about, eating and diabetes and obesity. And so it may apply to you even though you're asymptomatic. And so I think it's important, again, as we talk about that, why we do these early screenings and why we do know these numbers, because if we start early enough, those streaks can be controlled so that they never mature to the point where you have an event. So I think that's the important part here, is that it's not about treatment all the time. Prevention is our best weapon of medicine. And if we can be preventive, you could live into your 70s and 80s without cardiovascular events. So the earlier we treat, the earlier we prevent, I should say, and the earlier that we modify, your risk factors, the better chance you have of not having cardiovascular disease to the point where you're receiving transplants or bypass surgery or stents, or you're on heart failure medications, or, medicines for rhythm disturbances, et cetera. So prevention is the key. That's the best treatment.
Thank you. Dr. Nichols, I must say, you definitely do not look like what you've been through.
You are absolutely correct.
Thank you. And we're going to go ahead and just wrap this episode 2 on missed warnings and symptoms are subtle. And I thank you both for your time on this. And we're asking our guests to go back and look at episode 1 and 2. And next week, we're coming back with you with episode Stress and Symptoms. Chronic stress is not abstract. It leaves biological evidence. So thank you and have a fantastic rest of your day.
What you heard today is the part most people skip. We talk about heart disease like it begins with diet or age, but for many people, especially in Black communities, it begins with stress. The kind of stress that doesn't end, the kind that becomes normal, the kind the body keeps recording even when the mind says, I'm fine. If you take one thing from this episode, let it be this. Stress is not just emotional, it is physiological. Your body keeps receipts. We'll be back next Wednesday with week 4 of Running Out of Time. Until then, protect your peace and protect your heart. KMOB 1003 Radio, the intelligence source.